Welcome to day 2 of the World Conference Korea. I hope you all agree with me that it was a fantastic day yesterday. Well, today just gets even better. We have a very distinguished panel for the plenary session this morning. I think all 3 speakers probably need no introduction, but I will introduce them anyway. Our first speaker is the world-renowned architect Daniel Libeskind. Daniel spoke at our 2006 conference, which was held in Chicago, and some of you may remember that conference. It was called Tapered, Tilted, Twisted Towers. And I think at that time, it showed in the industry what was kind of all the rage. We were seeing this increasing move towards these sometimes quite bizarre forms. I think it's interesting at this conference to see how 5-6 years later, some of that has perhaps changed. Daniel obviously has a distinguished body of work all over the world, increasingly in tall buildings, but in other seminal typologies as well, starting with the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and spreading in almost every country of the world, including my home city of Manchester in the UK, with the Imperial War Museum of the North. You perhaps have already noticed on the front cover of our latest journal, which you all have a copy of, is his latest project in Korea, which is the Hyundai iPark project in Busan. But you don't have to go too far to see the work of Daniel Libeskind. Just on the corner here, the headquarters with the circle on the outside, that was one of Daniel's projects from 2003, I think. So please, without any further ado, could you please welcome Mr. Daniel Libeskind to the stage, please.
Delighted to be here. I love being in Korea, and this is a place that has produced so many great ideas and a very dynamic, creative people. So I always feel privileged in being here and also having a chance to work here. Let me just briefly tell you some things that I've been thinking about. We all know that architecture is a language, especially when it comes to cultural buildings. We know that they communicate many things to the audiences, to people. But I believe the same thing goes for example, tall buildings. They also are a language that has to deal not only with the technical challenges, which of course exist, but a language which is not only intellectual but emotional, because it engages the public in new desires and new ways of understanding their own cities. And of course, in such using this language to tell a story is really taking the cultural impetus that we always have taken for granted in cultural buildings and translating it into residential and office buildings. So in Reflections at Keppel Bay, Singapore, I drew this seemingly innocuous little sketch, but I was wondering what it could be to create buildings which are not just shapes, external shapes, but truly bring living into another spatial directions, and which produce really large-scale a city that is, of course, sustainable and environmentally responsive. Now, the word sustainability, probably the most important word in the 21st century. But to me, sustainability goes far beyond the technical impetus that is needed to produce it. It has to have a culturally sustainable spiritual idea that buildings really are more than what they seem to be. They have to aspire to something greater in the landscape and in the experience of people. And this is just part of the Reflections at Keppel Bay ground plan, which was, of course, on a bay which was really not built upon. There were some sort of canals there, but the idea was how to activate really a city and use the large components of buildings. We have 6 major towers, but also low-scale buildings, so about 12 stories high, to create a neighborhood that really allows access to the waterfront and creates really a complex environment that gives a spatial expression really to a very vivid city. You can see here that these are not extruded buildings. They're tall, but they're not extruded, and this is not just playing with a game of shapes. From the very beginning in this project, I thought, how does it feel when each unit is independent of the unit below it and above it? To some extent independent. So each unit is just slightly off in a double curved structure. And I think this is not something that people have written about, but my idea was that you feel differently, you feel more free in a unit which is not exactly, there's nothing exactly below you and above you. There's some shift, and I think that's true in the spaces which have been created in this building. Each floor plan of this large-scale moving floor plans, of course, there's a core which is kind of eccentric to the building, but the floor plates move, and of course, at the top of the building create crowns, also large-scale bridges which are publicly accessible, of course, at the site connecting the cores so that there is no issue of light. The light is perfect for all the kitchens on this side because the core connections are there. And of course, to create a really vibrant composition using spatial devices, environmental devices, landscape, clubhouses, social spaces to really create something that is a spectacular place to live. And I have to tell you, this is interesting that at some point of working on this project, of course, the developers decided it was a little bit, let's value engineer it. So we value engineered it to contain one large curve and a straight back. Now the agency, the planning agency of Singapore, when we went back to it, said, you know, we were able to give these buildings 1/3 more height because we liked the form, that the form was not simply just a large building, but had a connectivity to the tropical life of Singapore. So actually the planning agency insisted, and the developers very quickly did go back to the original scheme, which is these doubly curved towers. And you can see that they rise, and that there is a kind of a compositional logic between what happens on the ground level. And I think that's important when it comes to tall buildings, that it's not just, you know, how big they are, but how do they mediate to the ground buildings? How do they relate themselves to lower buildings? And how do they create an expressive environment that is good not only for the people in the towers, but the people who are also in the streets on the bay? And I think you can see with this pixelated notion of the buildings themselves, the luminosity, the changes of color, the crowns of the buildings, which really will become very, very green. This is just, they're almost finished. They're not completely finished. I think there will be a kind of new vistas from Mount Faber, from the downtown. This is, of course, easily accessible public transport to the center of Singapore. So it really has recreated, in a sense, what a residential neighborhood in the 21st century can be. And we were lucky enough that our clients asked us to do another large project just next to the site, which also has about 24 buildings. They are lower scale, they are kind of mid-rise buildings. But again, I think the viability of neighborhoods, I think, depends on their treatment as cultural works and not merely as residential neighborhoods. In Busan, in the Unang Hyundai Park, from these early perspectives, again, a very economical footprint. How do you create variety, and how do you create good units, given the tightness of the site? And of course, we have some office buildings, a hotel, but you will notice that really the idea of bringing that complex ground plan into the lobbies, into the buildings, even onto the elevations of the buildings was part of the idea of the building. And you can see that the plan is rather unusual. It has that L-shaped core with about 17, I believe, elevators, and it produces about 10 different units of various shapes, which actually give a vantage point, a uniqueness in the plan to a kind of sculptural form, and create I think, a civic space, or I should say a neighborhood that has an identity to it in terms of how these large buildings impact the ground. And you can see the connections of the underground, the smaller office buildings, the tower. The tower is about 300 meters, and of course, it's always how, in my view, how does a person feel? Not through just looking at the tops of buildings, but how is it being in the center of the neighborhood? How do you align the buildings towards light? How do you work with wind so that you don't create wind tunnels? How do you orient the buildings in terms of the most sustainable position in space? And how do you clad the buildings in ways? These are, of course, concrete buildings, as was except for the office buildings, which are steel. And I think you can see really a new ambition here on this beautiful tip of Busan, which is one of the most beautiful really spaces in the world, overlooking sort of going towards Jeju Island, and you feel the Sea of Japan. Something very dramatic, other than just this kind of formula of the quadrilateral, rectangular plan. So the plan, which is a combination of both curves and straight lines, L shapes and other kind of units, is producing, I think, identity for people who are living there. And of course, on the facades, on the spandrels, we have also a kind of a frit, a coloration, which is not always obvious, depending on the angle of light, enlivens the buildings, and the hotel is now under construction. Again, I think something that really embodies the ambition of Busan and this particular waterfront as a world city, as a world place. I had a good chance to work on a building in a country that I was born in. I was born in Poland, and I was born. I lived there, still under the communist, totalitarian government. And that palace on the left, the Stalin gift to oppress the Polish people, I knew it as a child, and it was always just the tallest building there, and everybody knew it, and everybody hated it because it represented oppression. I had a good chance to develop a tower, the Zlota 44 Tower, just across the street, as a kind of really, not just another tall building, it's a residential tower, one of the tallest in Europe, but a building that I wanted to kind of soar into space, sort of the eagle's wing, which is the Polish emblem of freedom. The communism is gone, there is a new generation of Poles now, there's a vitality, the economy is doing well, but there's also a cultural ambition to change the city. So it's really in the center, right across the Palace of Culture. And Warsaw is, of course, city destroyed in World War II, so it was rebuilt after the war. And you can see the large palace on the right. And of course, the neighborhood is changing. You can see a shopping center just to the south. You can see the old Soviet building still, the housing. But to create a building that really works as a great residential tower, that again is not extruded. The building turns itself, because there's a famous river called Wisła in Poland, so it turns itself to take advantage even of the lower level views. So one always thinks of the views of the top, which are the most expensive, but what are the views in the mid-rise of the tower, or even the lower points of the tower? And of course, this was not an easy task, because the government requires a certain attitude of light. No light should be cut off from the lower buildings, which were built in the Soviet times. So very scientific kind of study of how to shape the building in a way that still works with all the criteria. And you can see here the tower as it's sort of rising across and becoming really I think a new emblem, and it already is a new emblem for Warsaw, because people now see that the palace of Stalin no longer dominates the city center, and it's also a message that other buildings should be built really sustainable, high-density buildings in the center of the city, and then, of course, that Soviet nightmare will be just a piece of the history of Poland. So you can see it here. You can see on the lower left the streets, and I've tried to also sort of fit into create really a sense of the street, which was not really very much there. The new shopping center on the right, and this curving, complex tower with its retail lobbies, amenities, sort of on the upper levels where the garage ends for swimming pools. Also vistas and views of Warsaw, which are really... And here you can see that the building is rather complex. It's partly cantilevering. It's partly, it's trying to wrest its soul into a free world out of that regimented world of post-war Polish-Russian planning. And I think even in this time, there's so many blogs on the Polish, we go to Warsaw, people just like the building. They follow it. They follow every bit of its construction and every bit of its evolution. And I think it just shows that a residential tower can have maybe as much impact on a city as a large-scale museum or a large-scale government building or a courthouse or a huge civic building in changing the perception of the city, leaving its past, going towards a new 21st century place. Here in Seoul, we had a good fortune to win the master plan and also do some buildings at Yongsan. And the project I called Archipelago 21. And what is it? It's not just the fact that we are building 64 acres in the center of a historic city. This is a 600, 700-year-old city. So it's not a matter of just putting a brutal new plan into it, but how do you really navigate between the traditional streets, traditional neighborhoods, great scale of traditions, traditional streets and houses in Seoul, and at the same time provide really a completely new city. This is on the former railway lands, right on the River Han, with the mountains at the back. So it's a fantastic opportunity to really recreate a 21st century city. And what is it? It's really a city not planned with an abstract idea, but planned on based on the human scale. What is a human being? What do people do? When they work, when they go home, when they go to shop? It has to really communicate on the level of that ephemeral and ineffable idea of what human being is. And that's not just something easy to say by words, but one has to plan for it. You take the sort of grid, rationality of the grid, and the grid begins to be affected by locations, by the station, by the river, and creates really a new structure, which I call archipelagos, neighborhoods that are really connected by green, connected by water, and connected by the pleasures of walking in a city. So you can see in this complex plan, it's kind of organic because it really doesn't start just from an abstraction of some rationalization, but starts from where people come to, where do they go, how is the impact between the station and the waterfront, and how does the city look from that point of view. Of course, in terms of use, it's a complex world because it's an interweaving of everyday life. And to create that vibrant movement, like a river of energy that really leaves each one of these archipelagos to function autonomously as a neighborhood with many, of course, world-renowned architects working on it. Just to tell you about the city, it has about 25 high-rises, tall buildings, and about 66 buildings that are about 10 stories high. So it's really, truly a city, including one of the probably world's largest skyscrapers in its center. But again, it's not just about the height of buildings, it's how the buildings can really together compose a neighborhood and give the pleasures to someone who is coming there, who's working there, who's coming as a tourist to do business, to the business center, and so on. So I think really recovering the beauty of the river, recovering the traditional elements, traditional scales of Korea is part of really the effort here. And I think we are lucky to be starting on this project. We are working on the residential towers, also in an office tower. And I think like the Shilla crown, which was part of the inspiration here, something that is kind of amazing, but is rooted and grounded in something very stable and at the same time sustainable. That's really the idea of the building here. In Milan, again, we were fortunate to do a master plan in the center of the city. It's a beautiful city, very historical. This used to be the fairgrounds, and the fairgrounds moved out to the suburbs. So my idea was to create, again, neighborhoods with different architects. And I'm working with Arata Isozaki, Zaha Hadid, others who are doing pieces of it. But the master plan is to create a great green piazza in the center of a city that really doesn't have very many piazzas. And my part here is a residential, large-scale, high-density residential complex, which, again, has to be economical, has to be profitable, but also has to offer something completely new in Milan. Apartments that have light on all sides, large-scale balconies on which you can eat, a kind of grandeur of civic green space. And really, it's a project that will really raise the bar for living in Milan, because most of the stock of Milan comes from a 19th century building. So this is really a 21st century idea. You can see this cluster, the first cluster developing, and you can see that it's being shaped by both the footprints of the apartments, but also extension of the apartments into the space. And I think this will give it that interest, and also, of course, provide really life for the city. I'm also working on one of the central skyscrapers. There are three of them. Zaha is doing one, Isozaki is doing second one, I'm doing the third one. This one happens to be in the center, and my idea was to create a kind of a dome with the other two neighboring buildings. It's a building with which is ambitious, but actually uses rather standard ideas of how to stabilize a building of this sort, and how to provide the proper floor space ratio, the kind of compactness of the plan, and so on. And I think, again, it's a building that does have relationship to the historical buildings of Milan, because really one can plan anything and think of anything, but in a historical city like Seoul, like Milan, I think the buildings have to be tied to a tradition of those cities. And this building definitely relates to Ernesto Rogers, to the Pirelli building by Gio Ponti, buildings that are famous in the time. We're also doing another tower called the Arduino Tower, also on the same site, which is, again, a residential tower in a very strategic part of the site. The client thought this would be an additional project to the master plan, and also a museum of contemporary design, which is, of course, activating the park. And it's a museum that is based, like many of the ideas in this project, on the works of Leonardo da Vinci, an architect of Milan. In this case, it's an extension of his idea of the human figure inscribed in a circle and a square into the third dimension. And it's a museum that will complement really a neighborhood. So we have culture, we have retail, we have a park, we have a new piazza, we have new subway connections, making a very attractive new neighborhood only 10 minutes from the Duomo, and showing that modern architecture, contemporary architecture, belongs also in historical cities. That's one of the ways historical cities can compete with other historical cities, whether they're London, Paris, Frankfurt, and I think Milan is certainly one of those cities. And we're lucky also to be working in Rome on a project of a similar scale, how to bring new things to an ancient and very famous city. One Madison Avenue in New York, it's a project that is in the works. The developers are a little slow, but I think it will be built. It's a sustainable project because it's standing on a base of an existing tower, One Madison Park. Very famous tower on the left. The old tower was one of the most expensive buildings ever built in New York back at the turn of the century. And this is standing using the footprint and the base of that tower through mega columns to really connect itself. Now, to create a tower, you can see there in New York, not just as a stick, but a sustainable tower where every piece of the tower is a kind of a penthouse idea, that even when you're low, you have access to gardens, and you have access to a kind of permeability of the city in all four directions. By the way, the tower comes down all the way into the subway. And one of the ways that developers are able to do this tower is that they are also renovating the subways. So that's a very good example of sustainability, that you can build on top of an existing building, go through an existing building with columns, go all the way into the subway system, and also have an impact on improving the lives of commuters. So there it is. It's one of the taller residential towers, and it's carved out in a kind of spiral form with gardens so that every apartment has access to these gardens. And here, structure, you can see that it has the columns which branch out and kind of open the tower. I think it's very important that the tower isn't just introverted, but has something to offer to the city. And I think a tower that will have its own special identity, whether it's during the day, at night, because you can see through it, not only because it's made of glass, but because it has those gardens which cut the view out and frame particular pieces of New York in it. And now, of course, to Memory Foundations, which is a project I've been working since 2002. This September 11th, we were with the two presidents, the mayor, many governors, at the opening of the memorial in New York. And I just juxtapose these two pictures always because September 11, 2001, on the left was my first building open. The Jewish Museum of Berlin opened its doors, 9/11/2001. And I went to the office on that day and said to everybody, this is fantastic. Now I don't really have to think about history anymore because people can enter the building and enjoy the story themselves. And of course, at 2:30 afternoon, Berlin time, we saw those attacks on television, and the doors of the Jewish Museum closed for the next 3 days. There was such an uncertainty, and I suddenly realized that history is really intertwined. It's always interconnected. You can never say, piece of history is over. History is always ongoing. And what has happened in the past is always informing the future. So truly, when I started on this master plan, because I'm the master planner of the site, I thought, what could happen on this site? What is the memory, and how could we use the memory as a foundation for New York, knowing that there will be very large-scale buildings on the site? There was much dissension in the beginning. There were people who did not want tall buildings at all on this site, including the then mayor of New York, wanted only low buildings. There were people who wanted to leave the memorial as it was. Others didn't want any memorial, wanted a very small memorial. Well, in my plan, I made two decisions. Number one, don't build anywhere where people perished, because it's not any longer just a piece of real estate. So out of the 16 acres, it's a very small site in the center of New York, about half of the site I did not use to build anything, which is very difficult when you still have 10 million square feet of office space to build, another 5 million square feet of infrastructure, culture, path trains. So using about half the site, and in this early sketch, I was interested to bring symbols of America, symbols that really are part of what this site means, which is the Statue of Liberty, which is 1776, which is the light of the day. Those are elements that are not extra elements. And it's really when I went down to this low point of the site, the bedrock, that I realized how important this bedrock has to be for the experience of the site in the future. And of course I discovered this amazing wall, which we all saw, that slurry wall, that retaining wall, that sort of stood as a witness to that attack. Also an amazing piece of construction that withheld, had it collapsed, that the water of the Hudson would have flooded all the subways. So how to deal with this site, given that it is a very complicated site, and I don't show this for a piece of vanity, but I want to show you how political this site is, because it has already had 4 governors in it. It has had 2 presidents. It has had a mayor of New York, is still there, but on his way out. 4 heads of the Port Authority, families of the victims, with changing members of families taking part. The Port Authority itself, which is a gigantic organization. So to create a plan that means something, you have to be able to bring many interests together. And this is not a special zone. This is a site that's working in the middle of New York, in part of the marketplace of New York. So how do you bring unanimity when there's so many conflicting interests? And I think that's the function of the plan, of the master plan, to create a place, a civic, open neighborhood, open piazza, the largest that has ever been created in Lower Manhattan, to create a memorial, which I thought was very important, that isn't just two-dimensional but goes all the way down to bedrock, to create really the necessary towers, the 5 towers, which you can see cascading down from tower number 1, what was called Freedom Tower, to tower number 5, in a kind of embrace in the periphery of the site, giving light to the site, but also referring to the torch in Lady Liberty Center just to the south, and creating really a new neighborhood, open to the Hudson River rather than towards Wall Street, where they have so many tall buildings and dark streets. So that's really the sort of the original plan, and you can see what a leap, quantum leap it is in terms of height of buildings. And another idea was to use buildings as elements of a composition. It's a kind of musical idea. Use the buildings not just for themselves, and they are by different very good architects, but use them together to create a greater statement that together they will make when they are built. And here is the master plan. You can see that it has several features, which I'll go into, but it's also connected to other neighborhoods, not a standalone site. Chinatown, Tribeca, Battery Park City, Wall Street. These are all neighborhoods that suffered immensely during that attack, and it's really how to tie that site. So very important is the slurry wall and the bedrock. And that's my first sort of drawing, that the slurry wall should be kept, and the footprints should be kept. And of course, it's only when one really descends to that slurry wall, which is now part of the museum, does one really get the scale of what it means to build from the bedrock all the way to the apogee of the sky. I think an important experience for visitors, and of course, it's not that this wall, it was a piece of really difficult engineering to have a foundation which is not really covered. And I insisted, and I was lucky that all the space between the memorial and the bedrock is open. This was a space very useful for Port Authority infrastructure, very useful for parking, very useful for many things, to really maintain it as a public space. From the left, which is my first rendering, 2002, to the right, which is the latest rendering, pretty close. Of course, as a master planner, my interest is in the public space, in how to create space between the buildings, and what are the proportions of buildings, what is the character of buildings. And that's really what it is. And I just want to remind you that it's not an empty site. We have many, many levels of functions underground, very complex. You know that the path trains are running there, subway trains are running. So it's not just an open site, it's a piece of machinery. And of course, the memorial site itself, a big civic plaza. Michael Rudd did the memorial, very beautiful memorial. But I just wanted to share with you, because I proposed the Waterfalls very early on. And there was such a scandal in the New York papers that how absurd to have large-scale waterfalls in the middle of New York. You see this article, Waterfall, the WTC question, and the article goes on to say that it's kind of impossible, but they're beautiful. My idea was that the waterfalls would screen the busy sounds, create an intimacy for people who are at the memorial, and make it possible that people can have fun there while allowing others to grieve and be serious. So it's a very important urban element. And of course, the Wedge of Light, another space, extra space, which I introduced as the entrance from Wall Street. It's determined by the two times of the attack. 8:46 a.m. when the first tower was struck. It shapes the northeastern part of the site, and southeastern part is the 1028 line when the second tower collapsed. So that's a place, you can see that wedge. It's by the way the size of San Marco in scale, that's that extra public space. And the central skylight of Calatravas terminal is really on that line. I think it's going to be very dramatic, and it's a memorial in the light of New York. Of course, the tower, I thought 1776 was important because it's not just a tower that will be the tallest in New York. It should never really be surpassed in its meaning, the date of the Declaration of Independence, with the platforms at the old World Trade Center height. And of course, the buildings that really sort of surround the site in a particular geometric and spatial way that really give the message to people who will come there that it's a visceral and emotional experience, not only an intellectual one. And there it is from the latest renderings from sort of New Jersey, far away. The different pieces of the site, which is of course an ongoing challenge because it's always a site that has to respond to new demands. It's a complex site, and yet you can see tower number 1 will be finished next year. Tower number 4 finished next year. The memorial is already accessible. Visitor center will be open next year, which will lead to the museum underground and the slurry wall. The path terminal is under construction. The streets are being reconnected. So it doesn't have a single date when it will open, but it's a process. It's a process that I believe will be a healing process for New York. And I end here where I started, and I have to say, this is the first image I had because I was an immigrant to New York. And I came by boat. And to me, the Statue of Liberty, seeing it at 5 o'clock in the morning, arriving as an immigrant with my mother, my sister, standing on that boat, I was like the millions of others who arrived in America, looking at New York through this emblem, which is real to immigrants who were living under different conditions, is the true promise that you can be free. And the greatest freedom, I think, is represented in the skyline of New York. It's proof of independence, of liberty, of ambition, of difficulties, of the dreams, of getting better. And I thought that's what the skyline of New York should be. That's what America is about. That's the answer to these terrorist attacks, that it is the victory of life over these evil deeds. And that victory is about life, liberty, generosity, the ability to practice all religions in America, to be free of all forms of oppression. Thank you very much.